Welcome to another episode of the Early Years Learning Hub podcast series titled Professional Learning Tapas, where I share what I hope are some golden gems of learning that inspire you to make some changes to your practice that work for you and most importantly help the children you work with to thrive. Today's topic is how theories influence our work, and I was really inspired to write this episode from one of my units in my Masters of Educational Leadership course, which examined how theory influences practice from how we view children or our image of the child as capable and competent to how children learn and develop and how we can foster learning and development as teachers and educators. It was at this time that I really realised it was critically important for us to know what was not necessarily the detail of each theorist and a requirement to reference them in our documentation, but more so to really understand the way we do things in a certain way and to really understand children's behaviour and children's learning styles and just even the fact that how young children learn best through play. So all of the things that are really important for us to understand. It's not necessarily wrong to reference theorists in documentation. Go for it. It's just not necessarily something that I think that's not the important part, I guess, of what we're doing it. And as I mentioned before in our evidence-based practice pod, it's because these theories are valid, they're well-researched, well-tested approaches to inform our understanding. They're widely accepted scientific knowledge of how children learn and how we should be teaching them and what strategies work best for children based on these theories. And it's also important for us to note and understand where there are limitations, say, for example, in terms of cultural bias, or for children that develop in atypical ways, or are, for example, neurodivergent and might not fit typical pathways. So it's important for us to understand the theories, but also understand that some children and groups may fit outside those theories. So my take on where we should expend our energies is not, as I mentioned, linking theorists in documentation, particularly when it's something you're sharing with families, because I'm not really sure if families are necessarily interested, open to reading about that in their child's learning. They're definitely interested to understand about their child's learning, but not necessarily about the theory behind it. That's just my thinking on that. But most importantly, how using theory helps us in our assessment and planning cycle, particularly in the analysis stage by helping us understand and interpret the learning that's occurred, as well as in the planning stage. So as I know that these will be successful experiences because they're, say, for example, developmentally appropriate or on track with this particular child, or that they are, drawing on children's cultural identity, or that they are planned in a way that supports social and collaborative learning, all of those things. That I know these experiences will be successful or promote children's learning, these environments and these strategies will be on task, if you like, because they align with or draw on theory. So just a couple of examples to help illustrate my point. For example, we might draw on developmental theory to know and understand the typical sequence of children learning to walk. So typically starting at that very, very young age of small infants developing trunk and neck strength and back control during tummy time as they're very small babies, and then starting to crawl, fast forwarding quite a few months, often in lots of different ways, scooting along on their bottoms or dragging themselves along on the floor like a commando crawl, or the hands and knees kind of crawling, and then pulling themselves up to standing, taking a few wobbly steps or cruising around furniture. And then when they can stand up for a squat, that they're truly mobile and ready to walk independently and consistently. And we would interpret or analyse what children are doing in those things that we're observing to be going to the next step based on this theory. Generally, the thinking here is that children will develop in these stages at certain ages and often regardless of intervention from teachers. Not to say that we shouldn't do it, but we know and understand that's a natural progression. They'll eventually get there. Another example is from social cultural theory of development. In particular, I'm referencing or giving you an example of Vygotsky's theory here, where we know children learn in social contexts and they're influenced by their cultural circumstances, that children learn from more knowledgeable others, which could be older siblings, it could be other children, it could be teachers or educators that are the more knowledgeable others. We also know that they need to be in the right zone of proximal development. So something that's not too easy or too hard, just the right level of sequence or step. Next, that their progress and development is very much influenced by teachers who know where they're at and where they'll go to next, and using instructional scaffolding. So that's a good example of how theory might help us there if we're thinking about and analysing learning of why this experience didn't pan out so well. Maybe it was a little bit too challenging, or maybe we were lacking enough instructional scaffolding to help that child understand that concept or develop that skill. The other thing or time that I think is really important for us to think about theorists is when we're critically reflecting. So that could be as part of that assessment and planning cycle, or it could be as part of a response to an incident. It could be part of our continuous improvement. It could be because we're looking to take our practice to the next level. Be part of action research. It could be a lot of different things that we're critically reflecting, but this is what takes reflecting to the next level. So critically reflecting on research or theory or contemporary understandings. So asking questions such as, what theory helps me to understand this incident or this observation or this interaction or whatever it is that you're thinking about, and what are the limitations of this theory that I've been relying on. So for example, like I said before, I might not necessarily be able to draw on developmental theory if I'm working with a child who has additional needs, because they might be very advanced and progressing typically in one area. They may even be demonstrating high potential in a particular area, but they might be, behind typical development in other areas. So that's not going to help me in this case to understand that child's learning and how to scaffold that child's learning. So what else might be happening, or what other theories might help me to better understand this behaviour or this learning, or what strategy might be the best, and more effective way to approach the situation and facilitate learning for this particular child in this particular incident. An example of how critically reflecting on theory might be useful is if we consider a situation where we might have some challenging behaviours and we're not sure. We've tried a lot of different strategies, but we're not sure what's happening and why. But we know that we've got lots of educators putting out a lot of fires in a lot of different directions. So we might draw on attachment theory here, and we might use that to help us understand why we're experiencing these issues. And it might be because we have lack of available educators for children to return to as a secure base, or to seek that support or recognition or acknowledgement or validation or support in helping to manage their social and emotional development and interacting with them and helping them to manage emotions, stresses, and to self-regulate. So, if we think about the circle of security, if you've heard of that before, it's that idea that children need educators that are sitting down in interacting with them in the environment to support them to come back to and have that person available for all those things that I mentioned. So attachment theory could really help us to try a different approach to have, at least one educator, preferably more, in that space being available for children to be able to, reduce all of that time where we need to be putting out fires and managing aggressive behaviours and all sorts of things. So it might help us to formulate a plan of action as to how we're going to address that and how we might improve everyone's well-being and everyone's safety in that particular instance where we've got children with very challenging behaviours and often maybe perhaps violent behaviours as well. So that's another example of how theory might help us to figure out a good solution that is more enjoyable and more effective and improves outcomes for children. And that's really at the crux of what I think theories are there to help us do. I think thinking about them, discussing and reflecting on theory makes our work generally more enjoyable, more relevant, more purposeful, and helps us to be more effective in the way we work. And as I said before, generally contributes to higher quality practices that contribute to improved outcomes for children. So I encourage you to go forth and start researching some theories that might be applicable to a situation that you've got. Think about it, how you draw on theories in your assessment and planning cycle, and think about, how they could support you with any challenges that you might be facing. Some related Early Years Learning Hub courses that you might find helpful and or interesting include What and How Children Learn Through Play and Understanding Play-Based Learning. Those are both some courses that have quite a lot of references to theory and understanding research and all those sorts of things. And then another one that has a lot of references to theory is How to Teach. So how do we teach in that early childhood space? So a lot of pedagogical and advice and guidance that's drawing on theory and research and how it applies to practice. So links to those courses, those 3 courses, will be in the notes section. Don't forget, our podcast listeners get 25% off on all courses. All you need to do is enter the course, the code POD25 at the checkout, and that will give you 25% off all of your purchases. So I hope you've enjoyed another one of our Professional Learning Tapas series, and we look forward to seeing you again next time, next episode.